Hey everyone, welcome to my second of two videos on this, the Canon T60. The first video we talked about what everything was. Now let's jump in and talk about how to do everything with this camera. First up, because this camera is electronic, you can do nothing whatsoever without batteries. I'm going to show you how to install those. On the bottom is your battery cap. It's got this grip that you should theoretically be able to unscrew without a coin. I'm having no luck in that regard. So I've got a coin. This is a plastic battery cap, and as you might be able to see, it's a little bit chewed up from someone jamming a coin in there too hard. And so all you got to do is carefully unscrew it. And once it's unscrewed all the way, the batteries will drop right into your hand. Oops, there we go. Here is the battery cap with two batteries loaded in it. It takes two 357 or 303 type batteries, which are also called AG13, LR44, A76, S76, I think a couple of others. I'm going to take these out, and one of the common issues with this camera model is that the battery chamber has a little piece in there, I think, that falls out. Just a little bit of tin foil will make the connection. So if your battery chamber does not want to make the connection because part of the metal connection has fallen out, just fold up a little tiny piece of tin foil and drop it in, and you're going to be good to go. Okay, so two batteries, they go in with the positive terminal up, just like this and this. Okay, so when they're loaded, if you can read the text, you know they're loaded correctly. There's also a helpful little guide embossed or printed onto one side of one of the holding flanges on the battery cap. Quick note about batteries: just buy good ones. Duracell, Sanyo, Panasonic, Energizer, whatever. Those are all good. Don't buy the super cheap ones that have no name on them, no name brand. Those can rupture very quickly and expand and burst, and that's a really good way to completely ruin your camera. So just invest in the good batteries, because a new camera will cost as much as a decade or two worth of good batteries will. So to load the batteries, we're going to take the battery cap, the battery in the cap here, and you can see, by the way, what a clean battery cap battery chamber rather should look like. We're just going to insert them into the battery chamber, and then we're going to thread the cap in. This should thread nice and smoothly. If it feels like it's putting up resistance, back it out and try again. You want the threads to go right into the raceways, and just like that, we now have installed the batteries. To see if they're good batteries and if they're working, sometimes takes a minute, by the way. One of the known problems with the Canon T60 and other Cosinas is that the capacitors can fail. And when you take out the batteries, the capacitors discharge, and then it takes a minute after you put the batteries back in for them to start working again. And this is one of the cameras that has that issue. There we go. Okay. Also, one other thing you can do, if it's not responding to your batteries, try adjusting how this is seated. I over-tightened it, and I think I tightened it past where the contacts connect with the battery cap. And yeah, that's probably what I did. So back it out just a little bit, and now it's working again. Okay, there we go. So next thing we're going to talk about is lens mounting and unmounting. The FD lenses like this one, all you have to do is rotate the lens breech until the red dot on it aligns with the red dot on the camera, and you can now remove it. To reinstall a Canon FD lens, make sure that the red dot here is lined up with the top of the lens, mount it on the camera, red dot to red dot, and then just rotate it until it stops. It's not going to click in place, it'll just stop, and that's how you know you've loaded the lens or mounted the lens correctly. If you are using an FDN lens like this one is, red dot to red dot, line them up, rotate the whole lens until it clicks, and that's how you mount an FDN lens onto the T60. Beyond that, lens use with this camera is going to be exactly the same whether you're using an FD or an FDN lens. Now that we have put in batteries and mounted a lens, let's talk about how to load film into the Canon T60. We're going to open up the back of the camera just like that. We're going to grab our roll of film, we're going to drop it into the cassette chamber and push the post back into place. Pull out a leader, feed it into a little slot over here in the take-up spool, just like that. Rest our fingers, don't press, just rest them over the film tension sprocket so that the holes in the film and the sprocket engage. If you push too hard, what you're seeing right now is what's going to happen. The film won't actually advance. Be careful how much you press. There we go. Push it. Putting your fingers just a little bit behind the film tension sprocket seems to work better on this camera. Close the camera back. Now what we're going to do is make sure that we set the film speed. This is film ISO, so whatever your film ISO is, just select that. We just loaded 400, so we're going to set 400 to line up with that index right there. Now we're going to advance the film until we get to frame 1. As I do that, I want you to watch what happens with this knob. I'm going to take the slack out of the film here, and that's not exactly what was supposed to happen. I'm going to take the slack out of the film, and then as I advance the film, you can see that this knob rotates. If this knob rotates when I advance the film, then we know that the film is being moved through the camera correctly, and that all of this is connected and working. So you're going to go through your entire day taking your photos. You're going to go through your entire roll of film, 24 or 36 photos. Okay, just like that. Ooh, did not like that sound at all. Anyway, when you're done with your film, you're now going to rewind it. You push the film rewind button on the bottom down, and then we just start rewinding the film with the film rewind lever right here on the top, just rotating it in the direction of the arrow. Now, one thing I want you to know about film is that it's one and done. It can record light a single time with a proper shutter speed and aperture and proper focus to create an image, or it can record all of the photons that reach it at once if you do something like this. If you open up your camera while the film is outside of the cassette, all of the film outside of the cassette is ruined. Any photos that you have taken will be erased. Any photos you could take will not be recordable, because the film will record all the photons it can, and then it's done. But I want you to see what happens when you use film in a camera. When you take a photo and advance it, the film gets pulled out of the cassette, and then some film ends up in front of the shutter curtain. When the shutter curtain is triggered, the light through the lens is focused onto the film to create an image, and if your shutter speed and aperture are correct, you get a proper exposure as well. And then when you advance the film, it's taken up on the film take-up spool over here, and that's how the film moves through the camera. When you are done with your film, you push the film rewind button down, and now you can start rewinding the film. And the rewind action simply rewinds the film back into the cassette. The sound you're about to hear should be audible outside of the camera if you're not in a noisy space, but then you're going to fully rewind the film. At this point now, you can open up the camera's back and then lift up the film rewind knob, drop the film cassette into your hand, and if you're just starting out and getting used to film, rewind it the whole way so you don't accidentally reuse the film and get double exposures. This film's old, it's very hard to get it out of the cassette, so I'm leaving a little bit of a leader. But then you remove your film cassette. If you're going to take more photos that day, just drop another roll of film in, or if you're not going to take more photos, what you do is you close the camera's back, trigger your shutter so you don't leave it overnight or for weeks with tension on the springs, and you're done, just like that. Also, wrong way, make sure to put the camera into lock to try and help avoid battery drain. Although that said, this camera, whether it's in lock or not, will drain batteries just because they're in there, because it's got capacitor static discharge or something like that. So if you know you're not going to use your camera for more than a few days, take the batteries out and just set them next to it, just as a precautionary measure to keep the batteries from getting drained by faulty old capacitors. Okay, next up, let's talk about how to do flash photography with the Canon T60. This is your flash hot shoe. This is the only way you can connect the flash to the camera. We'll talk about why that's important in a minute. Your flash sync speed is 1/60th of a second. That's the fastest you can use, this shutter speed you can use, and get a proper flash photo. We'll talk about that in a second. Anything slower will work, including bulb. Anything faster, including auto, will not. I believe that auto will trigger the flash, but it can also give you a shutter speed faster than 1/60th, which can cause your images not to turn out. So if you're going to be shooting flash, shoot in manual exposure mode. The reason that 1/60th of a second is your fastest flash speed is because of the way that the curtains work. Now on this camera, the curtains travel top to bottom, but it's hard for me to do that demonstration with my hands with this setup, so let's pretend for the time being that the curtains travel side to side, okay? When you take a photo at 1/60th of a second, the first curtain opens. When it reaches the far end, the flash fires, the entire area of the film is exposed to light for about a 60th of a second, and then the second curtain closes. When you advance the film, the curtains reset as the shutter arms, okay? If you are using a 1-second exposure, the first curtain travels over to the far side, the flash will fire at that point, the entire film is open to light for about a second, then the second curtain closes, and then when you advance the film and rearm the shutter, the curtains reset just like that, okay? What about 1/500th of a second? First curtain starts, second curtain follows in pretty darn close behind. When the first curtain reaches the far end, the flash fires. Everything behind the curtain here is blocked from light, and you'll get a very thin strip of illuminated image that shows you how wide the gap between your curtains is at 1/500th of a second. That's what it does. With shutter speed, so the shutter is not controlled by how fast the curtains move. They always move at the same speed. The shutter speed is controlled by the time between when the first curtain starts and the second curtain starts. That's how this camera controls your shutter speeds. That understood, let's talk about using a flash. So you have to mount a flash on the hot shoe. The worst possible place to have a flash is right here, directly above your lens, pointing at your subject. So the reason for that is when you take a flash photo in this orientation, the light leaves the flash like in a wall, reaches your subject, bounces back to your lens, and because it's so flat, your subject's going to look very flat and waxy. If you're using color film, they're going to have red eye. Okay, so that's not a good look that you want to have replicated. So since you have to mount a flash on top of your camera, any basic flash will work. This only has a single hot shoe contact, so all you need is a flash that has manual controls and a single contact on the bottom of it, like this one. To get the most out of your flash, you want to have one that at minimum articulates so you can point it upward. Having one that tilts, or having one that swivels rather, will be even better because then you have a little bit more control. But why is that important? Think about the way that we see people on a daily basis. If we're outside, the sun is above us. If it's at night, the street lights are above us. If we're indoors talking to someone, the ceiling lights are above us. Our brains are wired to see something as lit from above as being normal and flattering. Everything we see is lit from above. So that's what our brains want to see, okay? So if you're going to get good results with your flash, you want to replicate the way that natural light works. Bouncing light off of a ceiling is a good way to do that. If you don't have a ceiling, but you do have a wall, getting a swiveling flash, bouncing it off of a wall is another good way to do that. So basically, the best tip I can give you with flashes is 1/60th of a second. Replicate natural light with your flashes. Because you only can trigger your flash with your camera, you can't control anything else. Get one that has manual controls. Learn how to calculate guide numbers, distances, things like that. There's a little bit of science in that that's well beyond the scope of this video, but that's what you're going to do with your flash and the Canon T60. Next up, let's talk about the focusing screen and how to read the light meter and how to use the focusing screen to compose an image. So when you look through the viewfinder, this is what you're going to see if you're photographing a plain white wall. But roll with it here, okay? Here's your focusing mat. This is the majority of your viewfinder image. This donut is your microprism collar, and this in the center is your split prism. Okay, we'll talk about how to use these in just a minute. This is your light meter. So when you are in automatic mode, there's a little red LED here that will light up next to auto mode to tell you that. And then as you adjust the shutter speed, an LED next to the different shutter speeds down here will light up. If you're in manual mode, which means you're manually selecting your own shutter speed, this little light next to the M will flash. And then what you'll get is a solid light that tells you what shutter speed you're set to, and a blinking light that tells you what your shutter speed should be. Okay, so your goal in manual mode is to adjust your aperture or shutter speed until you have only a solid light and no blinking light. Okay, and then that will tell you have a proper exposure. Bulb down here, B, will tell you that you have that you're using bulb exposures. Okay, over means that you have too much light. Your image is going to be very bright. You need to either adjust your shutter speed or aperture, or if you're in auto mode, adjust your aperture to give you a shutter speed that is within this range. LT means the same thing, but the opposite. too little light. So that's how you read the light meter with the T60. To compose your images, here's what you're going to do. You have three different composition aids. The matte screen, if something is in focus on the screen, it will be in focus on your film. So what you want to do, let's say you're going to take a picture of your friend over here, okay? If they're blurry on your matte screen, they're blurry on your film. If they're in focus on your matte screen, they're in focus on your film. Okay, but it's kind of hard to tell. It's kind of a small matte screen, and maybe my lens is a little bit dim, and I'm not quite sure if they're in focus. Here is this microprism collar. If you put this microprism collar over your friend, and it's pixelated and blocky, they're not in focus. As you adjust your focus, what's in this microprism collar will suddenly snap into focus, and that means that whatever you have focused is in that range is going to be in focus on your film. So the microprism collar is a focusing aid that goes from pixelated to in focus like that as you focus your lens. Okay, but my little stick figure buddy over here, I can't quite tell on the microprism collar because I just can't, I'm not sure. In your split prism, if you have a vertical line and they are not aligned, it's not in focus. As you focus your lens, these will come together, and then when they are aligned on top of each other, they're in focus. So if you have a wall, person's glasses, your stick figure buddy right here, and you line up that line in the middle, then that is what's going to be in focus. So with this, with the microprism collar and the split prism, you could point your camera to center compose your friend over here, achieve proper focus, don't touch focus again, move your camera back over here to get the composition you want, make sure your light meter reading is set correctly, take your photo, and that's how you use your light meter, the matte field, the microprism collar, and the split prism in the viewfinder of the Canon T60. So now, having seen all of that, let's talk about how to actually take a photo with the Canon T60. You've got your film in, and the ISO is set correctly. And you've got your camera in automatic mode, okay? So you've got it in auto mode, you're going to adjust the aperture until you get the shutter speed that you want. Then once you have that, you're gonna adjust the focus. Okay, I like that. Take a picture. That's simple, just like that. Okay, advance, you can go about taking more. But you know what I really want to do? I really want to try shooting in manual mode. Okay, so you're going to use the light meter like we just described. You're going to adjust your aperture and your shutter speed until you have only a solid light and no blinking lights. You're going to obtain focus. And if you cannot take a photo, what that means is you don't have enough light for your aperture and shutter speed to get a proper exposure, and you've got to make an adjustment. Or you have too much light, or the capacitor is not recharging. Let's try this again. You adjust your shutter speed and aperture, obtain focus, and in manual mode you specify the shutter speed and the aperture and obtain the image. If you don't get the shutter speed and aperture dialed in correctly for your scene and your film speed, your image will either be too dark or too bright. So that's why the light meter is important there. Okay, that's all great. What about double exposures? Double exposures are pretty easy with the Canon T60. I'm going to show you the mechanics of it, then I'm going to explain how to do it in manual mode and automatic mode. Okay, so the mechanics of the double exposure are pretty simple. First, you want to take the slack out of the film. Don't crank and crank and crank, just crank until you get resistance, and this will help make sure that the film is flat and in place when you do your double exposure. Then what you're going to do is you're going to line up your shot, you're going to compose it, you're going to take a photo, you're going to hold the film rewind lever, you're going to push and hold the film rewind button, and you're going to advance the film as you do that. What that does is keep the film in place, disengage the advance gearing, and rearm the shutter so that you can take your second photo, advance it. You've now completed your double exposure, right? Well, not so fast. When you start advancing the film after your double exposure, it can take a moment for the gearing to re-engage, so you might only advance part way, and then your next photo could potentially partially overlap your double exposure. So what you want to do is go to 1/1000th of a second, f22, take a dead frame with the lens cap on, and then advance the film, and that makes sure that your double exposure is completely out of the way for the next photo. So that's the mechanics of how to do it. Let's talk about how to do it in manual mode first, and then we'll talk about how to do it with automatic mode. Let's say you're in manual mode, and f5.6 and 1/125th of a second is the proper exposure for your photo. Film is designed to receive a certain number of photons, a certain amount of light. If it receives double the amount of light, you're going to get a negative that's very dark. It's called thick, dense, or dark. 3 words that mean the same thing. Too many photons. In darkroom printing, you're going to have long print times and low contrast. In digitization, you're going to have low contrast and digital noise. So what you want to do with your double exposure is have each of the 2 exposures be half the amount of light so that the film still only receives the appropriate amount of light from a single exposure. So if 1/125th and f/5/6 is correct, we need to cut the amount of light in half, and there's 2 ways to do that, with the shutter speed or the aperture. The shutter speed is fractions. So a really quick way to do that is simply to adjust to 1/250th. Half the time, half the light. Now you do your double exposure and you've got a single proper exposure on your film. Okay, but let's say you're at 1/60th of a second and you're using a flash and you cannot adjust faster than that and get a properly illuminated image. We're going to have to use the aperture. f/5/6, f4, f8, these are all fractions as well, but they're a different scale and system. For f/5/6 to f8, that's a single stop. Every time you adjust one stop, you cut the amount of light in half or double it. f8 is half the amount of light as f/5/6. It's a smaller opening. f4 is double the amount of light of f/5/6. It's a larger opening. So if you have to use your aperture to control your double exposure, you want to go to the next higher number to get half as much light. Okay, then do your double exposure process exactly as you would, and you're good to go. Okay, but I'm not going to use a flash. I don't want to use manual mode. I want to do this in automatic mode. Super simple. What you're going to do is you're going to select the aperture that you want. Now let's say you're using 400 ISO film. Every time you double the number, you need half as much light, or you're going to get half as much light. Film that is 800 ISO needs half as much light as film that is 400 ISO for the same exposure. So in automatic mode, simply set your film speed to the next stop up. Double that number and find that film speed. If you're using 50 ISO film, your double exposure is done with 100 ISO on your ISO setting dial. So in automatic mode, you compensate for your exposure by using your ISO setting. Go through it, and your camera will automatically give you a shutter speed that's half the speed it should be. Take your double exposure, and then remember when you're done to go back to your proper film speed and continue about your day. Otherwise, the rest of your film will get half as much light as it should, and everything will be really dark. So that's how you do a double exposure with the Canon T60. And with that, we have gone over everything that this camera can do and everything that you need to know to get going with it. Thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you in whatever videos comes next.